When Calvin bought his new house, he had no idea he was about to embark on a crazy adventure. It all began the moment he discovered something strange stuck to the ceiling of his attic.
What appeared to be a giant wasp's nest would turn out to be far more than he could ever have imagined. The house was rustic but beautiful, nestled deep in the countryside, surrounded by dense forests and flowing rivers. Frost still clung to the windows that first morning, and Calvin's breath fogged in the air as he stepped inside. From the moment he set foot on the property, he fell in love with it. It was the perfect winter getaway, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. But little did he know, his dream home would soon become a nightmare. Calvin opened the front door, eager to inspect his new home. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm rays across the wooden floor and giving the house a homely feel. Despite the charm, it was clear the house needed a lot of work. The structure was solid, but everything else, walls, floors, even the roof, had been neglected for years. As he wandered through the empty rooms, Calvin pictured the furniture he'd bring in, the wallpaper he'd tear down, and the fresh coat of paint he'd apply. But when he reached the top floor, something caught his eye, a hatch in the ceiling he hadn't noticed before. It was strange. The hatch sat hidden behind a large floor-to-ceiling cabinet, which had blocked his view of it during his first walkthrough. Why would anyone push such a huge, bulky piece of furniture right beneath a ceiling hatch? It was as if the previous owners hadn't wanted anyone to go up there. Calvin felt a rush of curiosity. He had to know what was hidden in the attic. The thought of uncovering a mystery in his new home both excited and unnerved him. Without hesitation, he pressed his shoulder against the cabinet and shoved it aside. The old wooden cabinet groaned, and the moment it moved, the hatch fell open with a loud thud. Above him, Calvin could see nothing but darkness. Dust drifted through the air, disturbed by the sudden motion. His heart raced, but he wasn't backing down. He hurried to the next room, where he'd left a painting ladder earlier that day. Now it would serve a very different purpose. He set the ladder beneath the open hatch and climbed up into the attic, flashlight in hand. The air was cold and still, too dark to make anything out at first. But it wasn't the darkness that made Calvin's skin crawl. It was the eerie, spine-chilling sound that echoed from somewhere within. A loud bang rattled the floorboards beneath his feet. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. What was that, he thought, fumbling with his phone to switch on the flashlight. By the time the light flickered on, the noise had already stopped. Calvin hesitated, the tension thick in the air. He swept his flashlight in every direction, hoping to make sense of the silence. What he saw next was nothing short of astonishing. There, fixed firmly to the ceiling, was something enormous. It looked like a giant wasp's nest, bigger than anything he'd ever seen. The size alone turned his stomach. But something about it felt wrong. The longer he stared, the more he sensed this wasn't a nest at all. It was something else entirely. His nerves were already on edge, and now they were in overdrive. He stood frozen when another loud bang echoed from the far corner of the attic. This time it came with a squeal, followed by a heavy thump that shook the floor beneath him. "This isn't a wasp's nest," Calvin whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his own heart. His mind raced, grasping for an explanation. He didn't need another reason to leave. Calvin spun around and bolted for the ladder, slamming the hatch shut behind him as he scrambled down. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. What had he just found? Once outside, Calvin sat on the front porch, trying to steady his racing thoughts. The house, once a dream, now felt like a trap. He needed answers. He pulled out his phone and called the former owners. At first, the couple sounded friendly, even cheerful. But the moment Calvin mentioned the hatch, their tone shifted. "Yeah, we saw the wasp nest," the wife admitted. "It grew a lot right before we moved out. We didn't have time to deal with it, and we figured it might scare off buyers, so we didn't mention it." Calvin felt his frustration rise. "You left a nest in my attic and said nothing." "We called an exterminator," the husband added quickly. "The wasps should be long gone by now. You shouldn't have anything to worry about." Calvin wasn't worried about wasps anymore. He was thinking about the thumping, the squealing, sounds far too heavy and alive to belong to insects. When he described them, the couple went quiet. "We moved out in early fall," the wife finally said. "Whatever you're hearing, it wasn't there when we left." That detail settled something in Calvin's chest. Whatever made that nest its home had moved in after they'd gone, sometime during the first cold snap. The mystery had a shape now, even if he still didn't know what filled it. He knew he couldn't leave it like this. This was his house, and he wasn't going to let whatever lived in that attic drive him out of it. With a renewed sense of determination, Calvin went back inside. As he climbed toward the attic, the same sounds returned, low growls, faint thumps, closer now than before. Fear rose in his chest, but he pushed forward anyway. At the top of the ladder, he raised his flashlight into the dark once more. A soft growl rumbled from the far corner, and Calvin took an instinctive step back, nearly losing his footing on the ladder. "Get a grip," he muttered, shaking off the fear. He was too close to turn back now. Moving slowly across the creaking floor, Calvin noticed torn food wrappers scattered near the wall. The sight only deepened the mystery. What kind of animal dragged food up here? A raccoon, maybe? No, the thumping was too heavy, too deliberate for that. Then it hit him. What if something far bigger than a raccoon had made this attic its den? His pulse hammered as he crept nearer to the nest. There was no buzzing, just as the former owners had promised, but something else waited for him instead. A small opening had been torn into the side of the structure. Without thinking, Calvin leaned in for a closer look. What stared back made his blood run cold. A huge, unblinking eye hung in the darkness, watching him with quiet menace. Calvin stumbled backward, his pulse roaring in his ears. He grabbed a broomstick, leaning against the wall, gripping it with both trembling hands, though he had no real plan for what came next. A low growl rolled out from the corner again, closer this time, and Calvin's throat went dry. Every instinct told him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. "Come out," he called, forcing more courage into his voice than he actually felt. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the shadows shifted, and a massive black shape pushed through a narrow gap in the wall. It was enormous, far larger than any bear Calvin had ever seen, even in pictures. It rose onto its hind legs, filling the space above him, and for one heart-stopping second, Calvin was certain this was how the story ended. But the bear didn't lunge. Instead, it dropped back onto all fours and turned toward the nest. With surprising gentleness, it lowered its head into the opening. Calvin stood frozen, mouth open, the broomstick forgotten in his hands. The bear pulled back, and cradled against her were 3 tiny cubs, no bigger than house cats, squirming and squealing in her hold. Relief crashed over him so fast his knees nearly buckled. The nest had never been a wasp's nest. It was a den built by a mother preparing to give birth through the winter. Fear still pulsed through him, but so did something like wonder. Still, the danger was real, and a wild bear with cubs had no business denning above his bedroom. Calvin backed toward the ladder without turning away from her. Easing himself down rung by rung, his voice low and shaking as he dialed for help before he'd even reached the bottom. Within the hour, a team of police officers and a wildlife expert arrived, tranquilizer gun in hand, the nearest ranger station. Luckily, it was barely 10 minutes down the road. The expert explained that mother bears often sought warm, hidden places to den for the winter, and Calvin's neglected attic, quiet and undisturbed for years, had offered exactly that. After a tense standoff, the team safely tranquilized the mother bear and carried the cubs out in a padded crate, bound for a wildlife sanctuary a few hours away. Calvin watched from the porch as the truck pulled off down the drive, a strange ache mixing in with his relief. With the bears gone, Calvin could finally begin the renovations he dreamed about. Months later, once the walls were painted and the floors refinished, he kept one thing exactly as it was, a photo the wildlife expert had sent him of 3 cubs curled up together in their new home. At the sanctuary, pinned above his desk in the very room the attic once sat above, every time he looked at it, he remembered the scariest morning of his life had also been the most extraordinary. Every time he looked at it, he remembered the scariest morning of his life had also been the most extraordinary. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you never miss our upcoming stories.